Good evening from Washington. I'm Larry O'Connor. With all the talk in this town about the indictments of President Trump and Joe Biden enjoying his sunny vacation on the beach in Delaware, you probably missed a pretty big story. You missed it because our media, well, they really don't get into the business of reporting news, but we'll report it. In a joint military exercise, Russia and China working together had 11 warships just off the coast of Alaska in the Aleutian Islands. That's U.S. territory, and they were coming up right against it. We ended up sending 4 destroyers to send a message that they should back off. But I don't know. I remember when Joe Biden was running for president, he was going to restore our military, restore our national security, restore our standing in the world. And now suddenly Russia and China is working together. I don't think that's a good sign. Joining us right now is Senior Research Fellow for the Center for National Defense over at Heritage Foundation and Navy officer retired, Brent Sadler. Mr. Sadler, thanks for joining us, sir.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
This is, am I overstating the case? I mean, Russia and China didn't used to do stuff like this together. What's changed?
Wherever there is a political or power vacuum, you can bet your adversaries are going to fill it. And so that's what's happened here. Over the last few years, weak or tepid responses to this increasing naval presence in our own backyard in the Bering Sea off of Alaska. This has just been allowed to progress to a point to where we have this highly provocative naval exercise where they've actually done live fires and hunting submarines, which is a varsity sport in naval warfare.
Ooh. Your book, by the way, U.S. Naval Power in the 21st Century, a new strategy for facing the Chinese and Russian threat, sort of fits literally right in with this scenario, what we're seeing over there. We've always had superiority with our submarines. Is this disconcerting that their main goal is to hunt for subs?
Well, it's not that it's a direct threat to or challenges our supremacy in the undersea realm. We still have an edge there, but we have to guard it and we have to double down our investments to keep that. What's really troubling about this is the fact that you have two very, large and dangerous rivals working at a varsity level of naval warfare competencies, anti-submarine warfare, in our own backyard. So it's highly provocative in that regard. And it's also historic because it's 11 ships. It's the largest that we've seen of this type of activity off our coast by the Chinese and the Russians together.
Are they sending a message to us, or are they sending a message to the rest of the world, Taiwan, other nations, like, hey, we're not afraid of the U.S., so if we come knocking on your door, be ready for us?
It's actually both. Right now, there's an exercise in Australia that's wrapping up with 13 of our allies called Talisman Sabre. It was not any veiled threat. State-run news in China, like Global Times, was saying that this exercise that started in the Sea of Japan and progressed up into the Bering Sea was in response to that. So the message is clear to the United States that China and Russia are working together and that the United States has more problems than just dealing with individually Russia and China. The other part of this is it's also really determined on how weak or how strong our response is, a message to other countries in the region that the United States is or is not a reliable security partner. And hopefully the message is sent with this increased naval presence on our part that we still remain a viable and reliable security partner.
It didn't get a whole lot of news, as usual. I really do. I hate attacking the media in this town as much as I do, but they really ignore our national security. They ignore our military. I don't think they know what they're talking about half the time if they try to cover it. There wasn't much coverage of our new alliance with Australia, specifically with regard to shared technology and crafts in the submarine realm. How important is that alliance now going forward, considering what we're seeing?
Well, our alliance is, first and foremost with the Australians and the AUKUS deal to help develop an indigenous nuclear submarine program. That's key. That's something that the Chinese and the Russians can't replicate. They don't have that degree of trust and allies network that like we have, and an allies that we are together, because we've shed blood together, especially like the Australians and the New Zealanders, but also allies like the Japanese and the South Koreans. So that is a significant advantage, but it's not going to be enough. The Chinese themselves have been spending double digits in their defense spending and growing their military and modernizing at breakneck speed for 20 years. And so we can't rest on this alliance network without investing ourselves to be a reliable and strong partner in that.
We're seeing high drama right now in Eastern Europe, of course, with the Ukraine-Russian war continuing, and a lot of talk about the NATO alliance and whether it needs to be reexamined, restructured. We've expanded now from Scandinavian countries as well. We have alliances with Pacific nations, but it's not a NATO-like alliance. Is it time? Is it time to actually think of a NATO-like alliance with other countries on the Pacific Rim specifically to face down the Chinese threat?
We've had similar things in our history, and they've never really worked very well. And SEATO is one, and it kind of came to a conclusion in the late 70s. Um, the culture, the political environment, and the history doesn't really lend itself to a NATO-like organization. I mean, NATO really, the trigger for it was Soviet blockade of Berlin. And that actually triggered and woke up the United States. It was several Western European countries that were trying to get us to enter into it, that the threat was real from the Soviet Union. The Chinese, the corollary is Taiwan. Taipei is the modern day Berlin. And it might be, but I don't think we're going to see an exact replica of something like a NATO, but certainly common cause through organizations that are loose and unofficial, like the Quad with India, the US, Japan, and Australia. But we might see something more, an alignment or a coalition that'll start to form in a very real way with coordinated military operations and like AUKUS, where we're investing in each other's military industrial complex.
I'm curious as to your observations about what we do hear from the Pentagon and the actions that are. I mean, our Secretary of Defense recently visited Asia. Our Secretary of State was just in China. It didn't look like a very successful trip.
Yeah.
Right now, the relationship seems to be China sort of dismissing, if not disrespecting, the American
Yes.
government under this president. And you don't hear a whole lot from the Pentagon about issues like readiness and about whether we're technically capable and ready to go if we need to go.
Yeah, sadly, so at Heritage Foundation, every year we do an index of military strength. The news just isn't good there. So there's not a lot that the Biden administration can really put out and say, hey, look at the good progress that we've made. That just isn't there. Uh, that being said, words only go so far, and having key leaders go into engagements, it's empty unless you've got some military power and economic might that's behind it in a real way. In other words, present in the region, that the Chinese can kind of register that against the words in the dialogue. And so you're right. The engagements in Beijing the last few months have been a failure because the Chinese are not really seeing any benefit to engage us. There's nothing that we have are willing to give and nothing that they really are seeking. The other part of it is our military needs to be more proactive in the Western Pacific as well. I think the trends that we see with this surface action group, the Chinese and Russians up in Alaska, that's a positive indicator, but it's still too small and it needs to be sustained. And that's the real question as I look forward, because if we drop off that presence, that'll send a very negative signal to the region and our potential partners. Most importantly, it sends a provocative signal to Beijing that, our staying power is not very good.
Yeah, and meanwhile, our recruitment continues to miss the mark, but in a big way.
Mm.
And it's no wonder, I think, sadly, because of the readiness numbers you just laid out there from Heritage Foundation's analysis. Listen, Brett, I appreciate you joining us. You should be a man in demand today, given the events that we've seen, and we'll call on you again, I'm sure, as this story is not going away. Thank you, sir.
Yes, thank you. There was one last point. I mean, for every Americans, this actually ends up in a dollar value, especially in the fishing grounds off of Alaska. In 2020, when this happened and the Russians did an exercise, they cost American fishermen $1.5 million in lost catch because they were operating in our economic exclusion zone. So it is a
Wow.
real impact on Americans.
Yeah, it should get more coverage. I'm glad we're talking about it tonight. More to come, O'Connor, tonight. I know they haven't made a whole big deal out of it, and you may not be paying attention, but apparently next year there's a presidential election. Yeah, actually, that's all they're focusing on right now, it appears. Well, we also have a third of the Senate up for reelection, along with the entire House, as we do every 2 years. And frankly, the race for the majority rule in the Senate is probably just as important as the race for the White House. And there are some seats that are definitely in play, including the all important Commonwealth of Virginia. Senator Tim Kaine, former running mate of Hillary Clinton, is up for reelection. And one of the men vying for the Republican nomination joins us now. He's a familiar face as he just ran for Congress in 2022 in Virginia. He's Hung Cao, retired captain from the U.S. Navy, and now ready to take on Tim Kaine. Mr. Cao, thanks for joining us.
Larry, thank you so much for having me.
Would you agree that the majority in the Senate is, all right, maybe it's not the White House, but if a new Republican president is going to get anything done, he needs that majority?
Oh, absolutely. But let's just look in the worst case scenario, also, we need to have a strong legislative branch that will hold the executive branch accountable. And that's not what they're doing right now. They're just letting, Joe Biden do whatever he wants, forgive debt forgiveness and just thumb his nose at the judicial branch.
Yeah. Well, actually, that brings up an interesting point right now. There's a lot of stuff coming out of the House right now that's just stalled in the Senate because the Democrats have the majority. And if an impeachment proceeding proceeds for either Merrick Garland or Secretary Mayorkas or even the president, it's assumed that the Senate will barely look at it and certainly vote it down. I mean, I know you haven't had a chance to look at all of it, but based on your understanding of how Mayorkas and Merrick Garland and the president is carrying out their office, would you be open to impeachment proceedings yourself?
Well, absolutely. I mean, we have to hold people accountable, right? They're accountable to the Constitution of the United States when they're not providing for the common defense. We have an invasion in the southern border, and not just from people from South America and Central America. We're talking about people from Yemen, from China, and
Yeah.
you and I know geography. They're not in the southern border.
Yeah, your potential opponent, Senator Tim Kaine, he always tries to run as a moderate. He's on the Armed Services Committee. He pretends that he's very interested in national defense and the military. And yet, with all of the incursions we've seen from China in the South China Sea, and now what we're seeing over in Alaska with joint military exercises with Russia, he's silent. He's got nothing to say. How is that possible? He's got some seniority there in the Senate, and he's just watching it go by.
No, you're absolutely right. He's just kind of he's the easy go lucky guy that looks like he's plays both sides, but if you look at the way he votes, it's very indicative. And what happened this past weekend with the 11 ships from both the Chinese and the Russian navies, it's pretty scary, right? I mean, they're right on our doorsteps, and no one cares. No one cares because they're not afraid of Joe Biden.
Yeah. As a retired captain in the Navy, how do you view the threat right now in the Pacific, and how our allies over there are basically pretty threatened by China, and they've got to see a strong America, I would think. Otherwise, they're going to start acquiescing to Beijing.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, we saw that in the Middle East, right? I mean, the once the Biden administration kind of stopped all the Abraham Accord deals, they turned to China, and they're going to turn to the strongest countries. I mean, we've abandoned 6 U.S. embassies in 2.5 years,
Yeah.
and so if we abandon that, then what else are we going to abandon? We abandoned Afghanistan as a country altogether.
So, talk to me about how you view the political landscape in Virginia right now. You had a bit of an uphill fight in a district that is increasingly leaning Democrat, and you fell short. But yet, at the same time, Governor Youngkin has soaring popularity statewide. Is your race for Senate, is that going to be different than your race for the House?
Oh, it sure is. I mean, let's look at the House. We took a very suburban and a very blue district where Joe Biden won by 19 points, and we moved it down to less than 6 points. So that's a 13% delta. And if you look at Virginia as a whole, Joe Biden only won Virginia by 10%. So if you do the math there, especially down southwestern Virginia and Bristol and Wise, I mean, they're very strong Republican outposts, as well as Roanoke, where my in-laws lived for 30 years. We're going to look at a pretty strong, victory. And people who say, "Oh, Virginia's blue," well, the last 3 Virginia statewide elections were won by Republicans: J.C. Miaris, Winsome Sears, and Glenn Youngkin.
Yeah, and their opponents in that statewide race in 2021 tried very hard to link those Republicans to Donald Trump. This is coming off the events of January 6th and the 2020 election, coming out of the pandemic. As you mentioned, they won, but the race really was a proxy for President Trump. Assuming that he does get the nomination, are you prepared to sort of maneuver that narrative the way the DC press will cover it and the way Virginians might look at it? Because President Trump has never won in the state of Virginia.
No, he hasn't. But I mean, the growing sentiment is that no matter whether you like him or not, I always say, hey, the only person who really needs to like Donald Trump is Melania. But you have to look at the policies that made America strong. You have to look at us being energy independent. And I think a lot of people will just overlook the fact that, hey, I might not like this guy or his mean tweets, but doggone it, I really like what he's done for this country.
There's a growing drumbeat out there right now for somebody, for Republicans, especially Republican uh, policymakers and thought leaders who were just looking for a more competitive race in the primary. They're saying, listen, we thought DeSantis was going to give Trump a run for his money. Now they're looking at Governor Youngkin. The Virginia governor has the highest approval rating across the country. And they're suggesting that maybe he should get into the presidential race. Do you have an opinion on that? I know you know the governor very well.
Oh, I know. I mean, he's a great governor, and he's done a lot of things for the state. I mean, it's a long way away. It's 14 months away. But like I said earlier, we have to have a strong
That
legislative
is a long way away. You're in the race. Your race is 14 months away.
Yeah, I know. I know, and that's what I'm concentrating on right now. I mean, I've got to win the primary first, right? And you might have the best rabbit stew recipe, but you still have to catch the rabbit first. And so we have to win the primary. And like I said, we need to have a strong legislative branch that holds the executive branch accountable. And so that's why I'm running for Senate, because we need to have people that believe in this country, that also have done things for this country. We have too many bureaucrats and lifelong politicians. We need engineers, scientists, entrepreneurs, veterans. We need people to fight for this country and not just give a lot of lip service.
You got to catch the rabbit before the rabbits do. Is that a Navy saying? You got to be hanging around with Marines too much. Tell me about your military background and what you learned in 25 years in the United States military that you're bringing to the table here on this race, something that Tim Kaine can't even come close to matching.
Well, I have the typical background. I was born in Vietnam, raised in West Africa. I went to the most prestigious high school in America, Thomas Jefferson High School for Science Technology. I went to United States Naval Academy. I have a master's in physics from Naval Postgraduate School, and had fellowships at Harvard and MIT. So just normal, typical stuff. But
you're a real dummy there, aren't you? I don't know. You're not going to be able to stand up to Tim Kaine in a debate.
No, but I paid back this country with everything I did. I paid back in 25 years in special operations, with combat operations in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Somalia. But I'm not done fighting for this country or Virginia, and so that's where we're gonna bring it to Tim Kaine, because here's a person who's held various offices for 30 years, but no one can put a thumb on what he's done, except he got stuck in I-95 with a bottle of Dr. Pepper.
Oh, right, during the snows. I forgot about that. Oh, that is the biggest headline Tim Kaine has made in the last 4 years.
Yes.
That's hilarious.
Nothing else, right? I mean, no one else knows what he's done for Virginia or for this country.
Yeah. Listen, this is going to be an interesting race going forward. And I think that a lot of people assume that Tim Kaine is just that same moderate sort of, he was the governor of Virginia. And if you look at what he stood for with regard to abortion, national security, funding the military, lowering taxes, this is not the same Tim Kaine. Joe Biden always likes to say, this isn't your father's Republican Party. But this is not your father's Tim Kaine.
No, you're right. But look at his time as governor. I mean, he really didn't achieve a lot. And so, I mean, I don't know if you guys remember, but he was supposed to be Obama's running mate, but he got passed over for Joe Biden. I mean, how bad do you have to be passed over for Joe Biden as vice president?
Ooh. Oh, that may be the toughest insult of all. I get you, Tim Kaine. You weren't good enough to be Joe Biden. Dang. All right, we'll have to leave it there. Hung Kao, tell us your website if any of our viewers want to support the race.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's hungforva.com. So HUNG for VA.com, and you can learn all about us. And all I'm asking your viewers is throw in $5, because we have over 8,300 donors in just the last 3 weeks. And that's the grassroots movement that's pushing us forward in Virginia.
That's how we win the Senate. And by the way, if Hung Kao is competitive in his race next year, you can better believe Virginia will be in play for the Electoral College in that presidential race. That's right, there is a presidential race. Thank you for joining us, sir. We'll be back with more O'Connor tonight. If you haven't noticed lately, the southern border is still a complete and total disaster. There's no control, there's no order, and people are crossing illegally, and they're able to stay here, and they're bringing God knows who and God knows what into this nation. In Texas is the front line of this invasion. Joining us right now is the Land Commissioner of the Lone Star State, Dawn Buckingham. Ms. Buckingham, you have a lot of responsibilities in this regard. Can you give us an update on your efforts, along with your governor, to actually stem this tide, since the federal government isn't doing their job?
You're exactly right, Larry, and thanks so much for having me on today, and continue keeping this at the front of the talking points, because the Biden administration will tell you that the border is secure, and it is absolutely not. We are seeing a massive humanity come across. We are doing everything we can. A few months ago, we actually declared a few islands north of the center of the Rio Grande as Texas, so law enforcement can have access to them to clear off the carrizo cane that the migrants were walking in on. We are stepping up enforcement all across the border that we can. We are partnering with Border Patrol to allow more surveillance towers in so we can detect the groups of people coming across. We're doing everything in our power to secure our border.
What can you tell us about this floating barrier that's been utilized in the Rio Grande? I don't know if this falls under since you're the land commissioner, I don't know if that necessarily is land, but it does seem to be effective and therefore it's controversial.
Well, the barrier is definitely stopping the migrants from coming across in the uncontrolled areas. And if they're interested in truly coming across legally and getting asylum, they can go through the controlled entry points, which doesn't seem to be where their main entrance is. But the interesting thing is why the Biden administration continues to completely avoid the rule of law, as it opposed to our border and many other things. They're declaring mussels, a little mussel that lives in the fresh water, is more important than human life. And so that's kind of how they're coming at the floating barrier, which is, of course, under Governor Abbott's purview. But, you know, the Biden administration continues to completely ignore the rule of law.
Well, I mean, they weaponized the DOJ and the FBI, so why not weaponize the EPA and force you to keep the border open at the Rio Grande because of a little mussel? I wish they used some muscle on the border through the Border Patrol. I know that the agents would love to do their job. And sadly, the people who are crossing this border illegally, many of them exploited, they're bringing over very, very dangerous drugs. What is the latest on your efforts working with state law enforcement to actually prevent that from happening? Because our children are being poisoned.
You're exactly right. You know, we've recovered enough fentanyl at the border to kill every man, woman, and child in the entire United States. It takes a very small amount of this deadly drug to cause death. And we are seeing that devastation across this country. And to all the parents who have lost their children to fentanyl poisoning, my heart goes out to you. We will continue to fight. We're doing everything we can to recover these drugs as they come across the pore that is our border. But everybody has to understand, not only is the porous border the complete mechanism for modern day slavery at record levels, but it is also what is bringing these drugs across that are poisoning our children, our family members, our fellow people in the community. And they're mimicking drugs that look like a normal prescription drug that you would get from the drugstore. So people are getting fooled. And that's the one pill can kill. You know, we just want to be sure people are aware of the dangers of what's really happening down here.
And sadly, this doesn't seem to get the attention of the Biden administration because they have a larger political agenda with regard to the border, which appears to be, if Donald Trump did it, we've got to do the opposite, which means we have these people crossing over. And I know that your senator, Senator Ted Cruz, has been passionate about this issue as he shows those terrifying wristbands that children wear as they're being sent across by coyotes. As the land commissioner of Texas, how much authority and how much ability do you have to enforce these laws directly with your law enforcement in the state?
Well, the General Land Office, we are the first ones to build any part of the border wall. In fact, a few decades ago, we had a flood control levee project that just happened to get a really tall fence on it. So where there's a will, there's a way. We've been doing everything we can to help get the border wall across. We've been doing everything we can to help law enforcement get access to the areas of the main migrant crossings. You know, and we'll continue to do that. But the bottom line is the federal government who's got to really step in and create a change to stop this flood of humanity. And as long as the Biden administration extends the open border, sieves, ties the hands of Border Patrol, it's going to be a real problem. But in the meantime, we'll do everything we can.
Well, as you said, you're doing everything you can, and it seems like the Biden administration is doing everything they can to make your job harder and to make the people of Texas' lives miserable. This latest is this wind farm that they want to put up in Galveston. This, by the way, part of the Inflation Reduction Act, because the way to reduce inflation is to install very expensive wind farms in Galveston, Texas. What is this all about? And I understand you're facing off with the administration and trying to prevent the permits from coming through.
We are squarely faced off with the administration on this. We're talking about over 800 square miles of wind turbines that are probably going to have a negative impact to the Port of Houston because they'll affect the shipping lanes of $800 billion. You know, and in an area that has major hurricanes and storms. And by the way, while the Biden administration continues to ignore the rule of law with regard to our border, it's also ignoring all of the environmental rule of law before it puts these fans in the water. The National Energy Policy Act requires an environmental impact study and statement, which has not happened. The Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act restricts anything that might hurt shipping or fishing, and this clearly will hurt shipping and fishing. You know, you've got the wind, the impact of what the blades do on the water that they think are